The rain came down in thick sheets, drumming against rusted rooftops and turning the dirt roads outside Port Harcourt into rivers of mud. Thunder cracked in the distance as Ebuka Johnson, just 13, sprinted through the storm, his school uniform clinging to his thin frame like a second skin. His sandals were soaked, slapping hard against the puddled ground, but he didn't stop. In one hand, he clutched a soaked envelope filled with crumpled Naira notes, his school fees, the money his mother, Martha, had spent weeks gathering from, washing clothes and selling roasted corn at the roadside. In his other arm, wrapped tightly in his sweater, was Tango, a limp, wheezing dog with matted fur and lifeless eyes. Ebuka didn't cry. Not yet. Not until he reached the dimly lit vet clinic at the edge of the village. He banged on the door, chest heaving, heart in his throat. An old man in a stained white coat answered, bleary-eyed and irritated. "Where?" "Closed," the man muttered. But when he saw the trembling boy and the creature in his arms, something in his face shifted. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and despair. The vet examined the dog, quickly parvovirus, maybe, or an infection, he couldn't tell without tests. "It'll cost more than what you have," he said flatly. Ebuka opened his hand, revealing the soaked notes. "This is all I have. It was for my school fees. Please, he's all I have. He's the only one that listens to me." His voice cracked on that last word. For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then, with a quiet sigh, he took the dog and wheeled him into the back room, shutting the door behind him. Ebuka stood in the small waiting area, alone now, the rain still pounding. Outside, his clothes clinging cold to his skin. The metal chair groaned as he sank into it. He stared at the door where Tango had disappeared, blinking rapidly to keep the tears down. He had given up his education, his one shot out of poverty, for a sick stray. But to Ebuka, Tango wasn't just a dog. He was a friend, a listener, a reason to keep going. And as the minutes passed like hours, Ebuka sat in silence, soaked and shivering, whispering prayers into the dark dot. At 20, Ebuka Johnson looked older than his years, his shoulders bearing the invisible weight of sacrifices made too young. He now lived in the teeming sprawl of Lagos, a city that pulsed with ambition and broke spirits in the same breath. Every day, he juggled part-time construction work under the blistering sun and food delivery runs in the evening, weaving through traffic with a worn-out bicycle. He never went back to formal school after that rainy night when he traded his future for Tango's life, and yet not once did he ever truly regret it. He still lived with his family in a cramped one-room flat in Ajagunle. His mother, Martha, his 10-year-old sister, Ada, and Tango, now old, slow, with whitening fur, but still following Ebuka. Every step like a shadow that refused to fade. In the years following his sacrifice, things didn't magically improve. In fact, they got harder. When Martha found out what he had done, spending his school fees to save a stray, she had screamed at him, cried for days, slammed doors in helpless fury. "You think you helped us, but you just threw your future away," she had said, again and again. But Ebuka had stood firm. He remembered how Tango had once barked furiously when their mother collapsed from exhaustion, alerting neighbors who rushed her to the clinic just in time. Since then, Ebuka knew Tango wasn't just a dog. He was kin, a protector, a friend when there was no one else. Martha, now 41, was a woman worn thin by time, illness, and the aching guilt of not being able to provide. She worked as a cleaner at an office complex and often came home with cracked heels and the smell of bleach clinging to her skin. She still clashed with Ebuka over his decisions, his refusal to give up on Tango, his lack of a diploma, the dead-end jobs. But she loved him fiercely, and it broke her heart that he had to carry so much. What she didn't tell him, what she kept hidden behind hushed calls to the clinic and balled-up hospital receipts, was that she was sick. Something was wrong, and she knew it, but she refused to add another burden to his back. Then there was Ada, 10 years old, bright-eyed and fragile. She was the softest part of all their lives. A child with a wheezy laugh and constant asthma attacks that left her gasping in the night. She was the glue that held them together, even in the darkest times. Every morning, Ebuka walked her halfway to school before heading to the construction site. Every night, he came back and sat by her bedside, making sure her inhaler was close and her blanket tucked. But life was beginning to close in. The landlord was threatening eviction again. 3 months' rent unpaid. The ceiling leaked. The food portions grew smaller. The future Ebuka had once imagined for himself as a vet, maybe, or even a writer, was now a distant fog. He had applied for dozens of jobs, tried to enroll in adult literacy classes, even reached out to NGOs for apprenticeships. But every rejection felt sharper than the last. No diploma, not qualified, we'll get back to you. No one ever did. And all the while, Tango grew older. His walks got shorter, his eyes a little cloudier. Ebuka sometimes watched him sleep and felt the sharp pinch of time. The cruel irony that the very creature he gave up everything for was slowly slipping away too. The weight of that one sacrifice, once so noble in his heart, now wrapped around his chest like a noose. He loved his dog, he loved his family, but he had begun to wonder, had love cost him too much? The sky was still a bruised purple when Ebuka pedaled home from his night shift, legs aching, clothes damp with sweat and Lagos humidity. The city was only beginning to stir, the streets still quiet, the chaos of the day not yet awake. All he wanted was to drop his bag, rinse his face, and get a few hours of sleep before the construction site called again. But as he reached the narrow street leading to their shack, something felt wrong. The air was too warm, the light from the small window flickering unnaturally. He fumbled with the door key, pushed it open and was immediately swallowed by smoke. Thick, acrid, blinding. Panic surged through him. The kitchen, the faulty wiring they had been warning the landlord about for months. A socket must have sparked while they slept. He stumbled into the smoke, shouting, coughing, "Mama, Ada." But there was no answer. His eyes stung as he lunged toward the bedrooms. Then, out of the haze, a flash of movement. Tango, the old dog, burst past him, barking frantically, tail stiff, eyes wild with purpose. He slammed into one bedroom door, then the next, pawing and growling, his body telling the truth faster than words ever could. Ebuka, disoriented but moving on instinct, followed Tango's lead. He yanked open the door to find Martha still groggy, coughing, eyes wide in confusion. He dragged her up, then darted to Ada's room. The child was curled in bed, breathing shallowly, a sheen of sweat already on her forehead. Ebuka scooped her into his arms, Tango circling his legs, still barking, still guiding. They stumbled out into the street seconds before the fire burst through the tin roof, the flames leaping like angry gods into the sky. Neighbors gathered, shouting. Someone called for water, someone else for help, but it was too late. Their home, everything they owned, was gone in minutes. The mattress, the cooking pot, Ada's asthma inhaler, burned to ash. Ebuka sat on the curb, Ada in his lap, Martha beside him, stunned and shivering despite the heat. Tango, panting and coughing, lay at their feet, tail thumping weakly as if to say, "I did what I could." For the longest moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of ruin behind them and the slow murmur of neighbors offering prayers and pity. Then Martha reached out, her hand trembling, and pulled Ebuka close. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed, not the angry, exhausted sobs of disappointment she'd given him for years, but the release of a mother who had come inches from losing everything. Between her tears, she whispered, "You were right to save him." Ebuka's eyes filled. not just with smoke, but with something deeper, the quiet agony of being validated too late, and the fragile warmth of love breaking through years of hardship. He looked down at Tango, at the dog who had once been saved, and who had now saved them in return. In that moment, as smoke curled into the morning sky, everything changed. The aftermath of the fire was a slow, suffocating unraveling. With the house reduced to char and smoke, the Johnsons were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and whatever could be salvaged from the ashes, which wasn't much. Their ID cards, rent receipts, family photos, even ADA's school books, gone. The landlord barely spared them a glance as he swept aside their tenancy, muttering about how he couldn't be responsible for people who bring problems. A sympathetic pastor from the local church offered Martha and Ada temporary shelter in the women's quarters behind the chapel. But there wasn't space for Ebuka. "It's not proper," the matronly deaconess had said. "Young men can't sleep where the women and girls stay." And so, Ebuka found himself dragging an old blanket and his dog into the rusted shell of an abandoned Danfo bus parked a few blocks away, where the city's noise dulled into a low hum each night and the stench of oil and rust clung to everything. Tango lay curled beside him, wheezing softly, his once strong frame now thinner, his joints stiffer. Each night, Ebuka would stare at the cracked ceiling of the bus and whisper to the dog, "You saved us, but what now? I have nothing to give." It was a quiet confession of defeat, with Martha barely holding together, her cough worsening by the day, and Ada's asthma making a vicious return under the stress. Ebuka felt the weight of helplessness like a chain around his chest. One afternoon, Martha collapsed midway through mopping an office corridor. Her employers dumped her near the church gate and sped off. The church nurse could do little no tests, no medication, not without money. Meanwhile, Ada wheezed in her sleep, each breath a struggle, and the public hospital demanded full cash up front before even letting her through the emergency door. Desperation came in the form of a man named Bayo, a distant cousin of a friend, who pulled Ebuka aside one evening, behind the church. "There's this run you can do," he said in a low voice. "Drive a kick with some ... items. You don't ask questions, you get paid. Quick money, fast." Ebuka hesitated, his stomach turning. But the money could get Martha seen by a doctor. It could buy Ada her inhalers again. He nodded slowly, not quite agreeing, but not refusing either. That night, when he returned to the abandoned bus, Tango stared at him, ears down, eyes sad. When Ebuka picked up the burner phone Bayo had given him, Tango growled, a low, rumbling sound that shook something inside Ebuka. He set the phone down. Tried again the next day. The growl came again, as though the dog could smell the weight of the wrong choice. Tango wasn't doing well either. The smoke had gotten into his lungs, and his movements were slower, his appetite smaller. One evening, while sharing a tiny bowl of rice with Ada outside the chapel, Ebuka voiced what he'd been thinking. Maybe we'd give him away to someone with space, money, vets. Ada froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth, then her eyes filled, spilling over silently as she clutched Tango's bony frame. "You can't throw away someone who saved us," she whispered. Her words sliced into him sharper than anything Martha had ever yelled. But the pressure didn't relent. Martha, sick and bitter, snapped more often, and Ebuka-ready teetering finally cracked. It was after another hospital turned them away. He dragged Martha's frail body home from the clinic on foot, sweat and shame mixing on his back. When they reached the church gate, she tried to thank him weakly, but something inside him boiled over. "You want to thank me?" he exploded. "For what? For ruining my life, for wasting my future. I gave up everything for this family, everything. School, my dreams, my time, and I still can't save any of you." Martha stared at him like she didn't recognize her own son. Ada shrank behind her, silent. Tango whimpered and backed away. The silence that followed was heavier than the smoke from the fire. Ebuka turned and walked back toward the rusted bus, fists clenched, eyes burning. He didn't know where this path was heading anymore, only that he was on it alone. Or so he thought. That night, the church shelter was cloaked in an oppressive quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest like a weight, heavy with fear and unanswered prayers. Martha sat on the floor of the women's quarters, staring blankly at the flickering candle beside her. Ebuka hadn't returned. Since morning, his phone was off. No messages, no word. Her mind gnawed at the worst possibilities. Had he finally given in? Taken the shady job? Had the street swallowed him whole? She hadn't eaten. Ada had cried herself to sleep hours earlier, clutching her inhaler and whispering his name between hiccuped sobs. Martha had tried to console her, but the truth trembled. Behind her own lips, she had no answers. Just a growing dread that the weight Ebuka had carried for too long had finally broken him. Then, just after midnight, the silence shattered. A bark, loud, desperate, again, then again, barking that didn't stop. Martha jolted to her feet. The other women stirred. She rushed to the front of the shelter and flung open the wooden door. Rain was beginning to fall again. The sky cracked open with a low rumble. There, just beyond the steps, stood Tango limping, soaked, one side of his coat matted with blood, barking with a ferocity that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes locked onto hers, wild with urgency, and then he turned and staggered down. The street bought without thinking. Martha yelled for Ada and bolted after him. Ada followed barefoot, still in her nightgown, her small legs struggling to keep pace. They ran through the wet, broken streets of Lagos, past shuttered stalls and sleeping dogs, Tango pausing only to look back, to bark again and keep them close. He led them past alleys and puddles, until they reached an abandoned construction. Locked there, under the harsh orange flicker of a broken street lamp, they saw him, EBUK, lying in the dirt, barely conscious, a gash above his temple, blood smeared down one side of his face. Two other men, young, rough-looking, stood nearby. Startled by the barking, they saw Martha and Ada appear and vanished into the shadows without a word. Martha dropped to her knees beside her son, sobbing, checking his pulse, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "He's alive," she gasped, voice cracking. "He's alive." Later, at the hospital, thanks to the pastor's intervention and some mercy from the night staff, Ebuka lay bandaged, resting. A nurse had stitched the wound on his head. He had multiple bruises and a cracked rib. He had refused the job, told the men he couldn't go through with it. They didn't like that. They beat him and dumped him like garbage in the lot. But Tango had found him, tracked his scent through the chaos of the city, bleeding and limping all the way. When Ebuka finally stirred, blinking against the pale light above him, the first thing he saw was Martha's worried face. Then Ada, asleep against the wall, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Then, at the foot of his hospital bed, Tango, the dog, was lying there, trembling, one eye half shut, his breathing shallow. His tail thumped the floor once, twice, faint but unmistakable. A wag of recognition, of loyalty, of love. Ebuka tried to sit up, wincing, but managed a tired smile. "Even now," he whispered, voice rasped and cracked, "he's still saving me." Tango gave a final wag, closed his eyes, and collapsed. Tango survived. Barely. The vet said it was a miracle. He even made it to the hospital that night, let alone stayed alive through the bleeding and exhaustion. But he was different. Naufral bones, more pronounced under his thinning coat, eyes slower to open. The vet didn't sugarcoat it. "Could be months, could be days," she said gently, patting Ebuka on the shoulder. Ebuka nodded, not trusting. His voice, "For now." Tango was breathing. That was enough. Then the story broke. A local reporter who had been covering urban crime got wind of what had happened. The dog that had tracked his bleeding owner across half the city, barking until help came. He framed it not just as an act of animal loyalty, but as a testament to survival, love, and the invisible bonds of family. In a city that forgets its poor, the article read, a dog remembered. The piece went viral within days. Local blogs picked it up, then national ones. Photos of Tango, wrapped in a blanket beside Ebuka's hospital bed, flooded social media. People were moved. Donations poured in not just for vet bills, but for Ebuka and his family. An animal rights foundation stepped in to cover Tango's care and vaccinations. A construction firm whose manager had once grown up in a similar neighborhood reached out to offer Ebuka a paid apprenticeship, with the chance to learn and eventually earn a certification. With the money, Ebuka did what he'd always dreamed of. He fixed things, starting with his own family. Martha finally went to a hospital and began treatment for her condition. Ada got her inhalers and a regular checkup schedule. They moved out of the church quarters into a small but clean one-room apartment with a real front door and running water. The walls were thin, but they were theirs. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had in years. More than Ebuka thought he'd ever have again. One evening, Ebuka sat quietly on the apartment floor, legs folded, his back against the wall. Tango lay beside him on a soft blanket, eyes half-lidded, tail twitching now and then. He reached down and stroked the dog's side gently, feeling the steady rhythm of breath. Outside, the sounds of Lagos hummed the distant buzz of a generator, the sharp bark of another dog, the clink of a neighbor washing dishes. "I'm going back to school," Ebuka whispered, voice steady but low. "I'll finish what I started." He looked down at Tango, whose ears twitched slightly in response, but not alone this time. Months passed, and the rhythm of life, though still modest, had settled into something that finally resembled peace. Ebuka, now wearing the crisp, modest uniform of a night school student, stepped out of class as dusk painted the sky in deep orange and soft indigo. The city buzzed around him, but his pace was unhurried. There was a calm in him that hadn't existed before, a quiet determination earned through loss, love, and a journey few could ever understand. He walked home through the familiar side streets, shoes dusty from the road, his books tucked under his arm, his heart lighter than it had been in years. When he opened the door to their new one-room apartment, the scent of simmering egusi filled the air, warm and grounding. Inside, the small space glowed with soft light. Martha stood at the single gas burner, stirring gently, a peaceful look. On her face, her cheeks had color again. The weight in her shoulders had eased. Ada, curled up on a floor mat, read aloud from a borrowed children's book, her voice clear, careful. Just beside her, nestled in a blanket-lined corner, was Tango, his fur grayer now, his eyes slower to open, but his chest rising and falling with quiet strength. He stirred slightly as Ebuka entered, lifting his head with effort. Ebuka walked over, knelt by him slowly, and placed a hand on his side. The warmth was still there. That heartbeat faint, but presence still pulsed beneath his palm. He didn't say much, just sat with him for a moment, hand resting on the dog who had changed the course of his life. Then, softly, he said, "You were never just a dog. You were family, and you saved us all." Tango looked at him, eyes soft and knowing. Then his tail moved, just once, a slow, gentle wag. "Fade out,"